The mission of the Museum of Us is to inspire human connections by exploring the human experience. The main museum is housed in the California building with its landmark tower. The California Quadrangle, California Building, and California Tower are historic structures located in Balboa Park in San Diego, California. They were built for the 1915 to 1916 Panama, California Exposition and served as the grand entry to the expo.
Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the Museum of Us in beautiful Balboa Park on the homeland of the Kumeyaay Nation. And we always like to kind of start off that introduction about the museum to remind everybody that this is traditional Kumeyaay land, and to remind everyone when they visit the museum in the Balboa Park that we weren't the first people here. And the Kumeyaay community still live in the San Diego area and are really a vibrant community. So here we are in front of the Museum of Us building, which is also historically called the California Building and Tower. And it was built in 1915 for the Panama, California Exposition. And the question that I always get, or very frequently get, is is this a church, or was it a church? Because it certainly looks like one, but it was never a church. It was always meant to be a display area, an exhibit space, and a museum. And for many years, this was known as the San Diego Museum of Man. We've been the Museum of Us since August of 2020, and it was really a name that we adopted to really be a public commitment to inclusivity and to the anti-racism and decolonial work that the museum's been doing for well over 10 years. And to kind of start that discussion off, I'd like to point everybody to the facade of the museum, which is very beautiful and people really love to see. And when you think of a church facade like this, there are usually saints and religious figures on it. This building actually has the busts and statues of 9 European colonizers on it. And so we really like to point that out because it's really, as a decolonial museum, we have a Google Arts and Culture exhibit that you can access on their app. And it's an exhibit about these 9 individuals from the point of view of Native Americans, who have a very different view of these 9 individuals than people who have studied them from a European perspective. And so we like to kind of show those different kinds of perspectives at the museum. It's something that we're really committed to kind of showing different perspectives from all kinds of different cultures, and especially those perspectives that we don't hear so often in our kind of standard history books. The title of the exhibit is a little sensational. We meant it to be that way in some ways, to kind of get people's attention. But really, in some ways, this exhibit is about othering, or cultural othering, which is certainly a topic that has been in the forefront of kind of popular culture and all kind of the cultural discussions going on. And I'll get into that in a little more, why that exhibit is this way. But when you first walk into the exhibit, we wanted people just to be hit with all these different ways that cannibalism has been shown in popular culture, because you don't even think about all the different ways and all the different movies and books. You have Fried Green Tomatoes, you have all these different movies, and American Psycho, and Deliverance, and all these ways that you kind of forget that the topic of cannibalism pops up. And so we wanted just people to have that kind of in the back of their minds as they came into the exhibit, to be reminded. Robinson Crusoe and Joseph Conrad, and some of the more kind of classical literature where the discussion is also done around cannibals, and how cannibals have been presented in in literature when these European discoverers were coming and being in contact with these new peoples, that there were kind of two trains of thought. Many of these people were enslaved, and then some were Christianized, and some were both. A kind of edict put through by the church that if a community could be shown to be cannibals, then it was okay to enslave them. They were really considered lesser, and so if a community were cannibals, then God was okay with you enslaving them. If they weren't, you should just worry about Christianizing them. This exhibit starts to talk about that and have us start thinking about that, and how that might affect how we think about it today. There are a lot of really kind of fascinating objects that were on display. My favorite one here is this mask, really from British Columbia area, and it's really beautiful, and we have permission from the community to have it on display. The only request was to make sure to keep the mouth open, and this mask was often associated by Westerners with cannibalism rites. There's actually no proof that that's ever what happened with this mask or those rites, but that's kind of became what Westerners thought it was. And so those kind of dances were banned and not allowed in communities. And so this mask is very symbolic of often what happened, kind of an erasure of community tradition because it was branded in, as being something that was cannibalistic. In the 60s, probably in the 50s too, he traveled the world to buy objects from communities, often in kind of New Guinea, kind of that part of the world, basically. He disappeared, and he's never been found, and there have been many stories that he was eaten by cannibals in this part of the world. And you hear, even a few years ago, there was another book that came out that said, we've talked to descendants of the people who found, who captured him and ate him, and we know for a certain that he was eaten. No one knows the truth, but it's become this legend almost. And the Rockefellers spent a huge amount of money trying to find him. It was this international search. It went on for quite a long time for them trying to find him. Nothing has ever been found of Michael Rockefeller. And this object here is from our cultural resources, and it's one that he collected. Ota Benga was taken from the Congo in the early 1900s to be displayed at the St. Louis World's Fair. And this was very common at World's Fairs at the time. In fact, the Panama, California Exposition here in Balboa Park, this is Kumeyaay land. Kumeyays were removed from Florida Canyon for Balboa Park to be created. And during the Panama, California Exposition, Native Americans from Arizona and New Mexico were bussed to create a living display of American Native Americans. But the organizers didn't think Kumeyaay looked Indian enough, is the way that it was put, even though they're the Native Americans from this part of the world. But anyway, the display of cultures at World's Fair is very typical of the early 20th century. Ota Benga and a few other members of his community were brought to St. Louis to be in the 1904 World's Fair. And then after that fair, and displayed as cannibals. There's also no proof that Ota Benga was a cannibal or that his specific tribal group were cannibals. They filed their teeth, and that was what men did when they came out of adolescence to kind of be warriors. So it didn't have anything to do necessarily about being cannibals. It was part of being a man and a warrior in their community. And so he had these very filed teeth, and so people thought he was a cannibal, and he was put on display, and then later moved to the Bronx Zoo, which had just opened, and put on display in the Monkey House. He never was able to go home, and he lived, I think a missionary kind of adopted him, and he eventually took his own life. There is a genetic marker in all humans that shows in our distant past we ate each other. It's part of, from eating human brain, it created a genetic marker. We all have it. And so at some point in the distant humanoid past, people ate each other. In medieval and early modern Europe, medicine often included human blood. They would grind up skull moss, mummy parts, all kinds of things, and use them as medicine. This area is really devoted to, I'm sure you've heard about the plane crash in the Andes of the football team. And so this is a video where the survivors were taken up to the site, and then they were interviewed. And it's really a fascinating set of interviews because they talk about how some of them viewed it as almost a religious, like taking communion. And so they really viewed it as this almost holy kind of way of surviving, and how their friends were basically allowing them to survive, and how they talked about how they were thinking about their families, and that, I think one of the survivors said, he knew that if he died, his mother would just be so devastated that he felt it was his responsibility to survive so that he could return to his mother. And so again, it's talking about cannibalism from different kinds of viewpoints, and how people have made this decision, and it's not an easy decision for them. In Leningrad during World War II, so there was a lot of survival cannibalism during wartime. And so here's some of the stories about just surviving the siege, the Nazi siege of Leningrad during World War II, and the winter, and all of that. From the 1600s all the way into the 1800s, it was considered the law of the sea. If you were shipwrecked and you had no food and you needed to survive in cannibalism, you were not prosecuted. It was considered like an acceptable way of survival. And there are many documented cases, and here are examples of documented cases from the 1600s all the way into the 1800s of shipwrecks, and basically, there would be inquiries, but people were not prosecuted for murder or cannibalism. And it wasn't really until the 1880s that started to change. Now you're in the inside of the Museum of Us, and really in the main rotunda space. And like a church or a cathedral, it is really dominated by this very large domed area. And it's really kind of the central space at the museum. We do a lot of public programming in here. And two of the main exhibits that I like to talk about here in the museum, in the rotunda, are ones that really speak to both our kind of regional area and the expertise at the museum around decolonizing work. So this exhibit to my right, Hostile Terrain 94, really looks at a lot of the border issues that are happening not only in the California-Mexico border, but at the Arizona-Mexico border. And it really kind of strives to humanize the statistics that we see in the news that we see on social media and in kind of traditional news programs, that this whole kind of issue of people crossing the border. And one of the main aspects of that, and if you want to walk this way, there's a really striking part of this exhibit. And on this back wall, the Undocumented Migration Project, who we worked very closely with on the exhibit, really started the Hostile Terrain Project, has this map of the Arizona-Mexico border. And these tags that you see on the map are actually toe tags of individuals who died crossing the border. And they're in two different colors. So there's a color that indicates identified remains and the color that identifies or has unidentified. So identified and unidentified remains. And we have programs where people come and fill these toe tags out, and then we put them on the map, and they're geolocated, so they're exactly where those individuals were found. And it's to really help people start understanding the human cost around the border. And it's really such a polarizing issue that we really think it's important for people to see it from lots of different angles and lived, experiences. And along with this map, there are objects that were found along the trails that many of the undocumented individuals cross in their journey to reach the United States. And also really a focus on the Tohono O'odham people, who are the Native American peoples of this area. And this whole idea of hostile terrain was kind of an overall umbrella term to talk about policy changes that really happened in the 1990s, really trying to push people away from crossing at major urban areas, and with the idea that, people won't cross in the desert, it's too hostile, but people still do, and then people die. And it's really heart-rending sometimes to read these tags, because people not only die from extreme heat and dehydration, but cold and violence. And so you see children dying of violence, and all kinds of things that really start making you think about the issue in many, many different ways. Of course, really, obviously, one of the main things that you see when you come into the museum, the Rotunda, are these stelae, and these Mayan stelae. And these are actual casts that were made from Mayan stelae in 1913, 1914. So it was very popular in that time period academically to make casts of large objects if they didn't actually get taken from their original spots, which many museums did take them. But even if you go to the Victoria and Albert Museum today, they have a huge hall of just casts. So it was very common at this time period to do casts. And so these stelae have been in the museum since it opened in 1915. And scholars for many decades would come to look at them because the originals, being out in the weather, have lost more and more detail over the years, while these casts look exactly like they did, in 1913 and 1914. So we had this Maya exhibit, basically a version of it, ever since the museum opened in 1915. And really right before the pandemic, as part of our decolonial work, we decided we really wanted to look at this old exhibit that had been developed in ways that we're really trying to look at more thoughtfully now in this century. And in that, what I really mean is really kind of talking to the community. Things that we hear over and over again from indigenous and native communities is that museums have this record of showing objects from the perspective of Western European academics, and it's not the community's voice that's being heard in the exhibit. It's an academic voice from a European person outside the community, and there's understandably a lot of distrust about this. And so we started work in 2019, 2020, reaching out to Maya community members. There's a large Maya community, actually a diaspora across the world. And we worked with Maya community consultants, and they worked with us, many because it was during the pandemic virtually, but we did have some visits here, and and really to work with us to redo the exhibit in a way that was the lens was much more decolonized, meaning that it was reflective of the voice of the community rather than the traditional European academic voice. One of the things that we hear over and over again from communities is they want people to know that, for example, the Maya community still exists. There are still Mayan people. They didn't disappear from the face of the earth, which is what old kind of exhibits tended to just focus on, these kind of so-called ancient versions of peoples, and haven't really shown them as a living, vibrant, and resilient community. And so this is what this exhibit really hopes to do. We have something called the Colonial Pathways Policy, and our board approved that in 2017, 2018, and it really commits this institution to be consulting with Native and Indigenous communities, both in the United States and across the world, and to really share with those communities what objects we have from those communities, and then to have consultations about what they would like back. I've been a longtime favorite of visitors to the museum, and as an academically trained archaeologist, it's always certainly popular with me. Like most people from my age group, you kind of got interested in archaeology from King Tut's tomb. Sorry, that's the way we all were fascinated by it, and so this exhibit is full of magic of ancient Egypt, and it's certainly, in its presentation, is more traditional in the approach of kind of archaeology exhibits. But we did do a refresh of it a few years ago. I think the most important one of that is that we no longer have human remains or mummified ancestors on display. And so that was a decision of this institution that we would no longer display human remains without the permission of their descendants. And so we do not have permission to display them, so they are no longer on display. Many objects were donated to the museum by Ellen Browning Scripps. So in the early 20th century, she had supported a lot of Egyptology that was done in the early 20th century. And so, so this is a lot of legacy of the Scripps family, which is certainly a name that people know nationally, but certainly in San Diego. If you've been here or are part of the San Diego community, you know about the Scripps family. And actually through the really generous support of the Scripps Foundation, hired a conservator to come in, that was probably 2018, 2019, to come and re-look at all the mounts and, make sure that everything was okay and that nothing was deteriorating, and have people see some of the just kind of home objects like these headrests, which I think, we all tend to, how on earth did anyone sleep with headrests like that? We've had this Race, Are We So Different exhibit since 2015. There was an initial installation of it in 2011, but we installed it as a core exhibit in 2015. And what it really means to do, well, there are several things that it's meant to do, and it's done really well over the years, is really start a conversation about race in a thoughtful way, and considering the debates and the conversations that we hear publicly about race right now. It's really important to have conversations that are really more thoughtfully grounded. But one of these ideas is that race has been a biological construct, and it's really a social construct. And this museum actually has a history. It's an anthropology museum and was founded in the early 20th century when the idea was that race was biological and there was a hierarchy of races. And this museum's first exhibit was called Man Through the Ages, and it really presented races in this kind of hierarchy. And so we have actually truth-telling from our own institutional standpoint to talk about how the museum had a role in really creating this structural racism. And so this exhibit really talks about race as a social construct, and how the genetic and biological differences that we see for example, in skin color are no different than the eye color or height or, any other thing. There were all these social constructs that created where suddenly, a skin color was this way of determining all kinds of things. And so we've spent the last 2 years developing content for a new exhibit. And so we're actually just started the production stage of that. And so the new exhibit's going to be called Race, Power, Resistance, and Change. So we're hoping for a 2025 opening. Post Secret is a community art project founded by Frank Warren in, I think, 2004. He put several hundred postcards around in his community on the East Coast. And they were in libraries and, kind of all over the place. And it was a very simple instruction. It was just put the secret that you've not told anybody anonymously and send it to this mailbox. And he thought he would get a few. He was just kind of curious to see what the response would be. Well, now, well over 10 years, almost 20 years now, I think, he's had over 1 million postcards come in. And when you think about it, this museum is about the human experience. What is more human than having secrets? Like, we all have secrets. It's one of the things that makes us human is our secrets. And so this exhibit is really impactful on people. People love it. They spend so much time in it. We worked with Frank. In fact, he was here last week doing an in-person meet and greet with folks, talking about the project. One of the things that Frank wanted this exhibit to do, and he emphasized when it was being designed, was he didn't want it too curated. He wanted it to be like he receives secrets every day. So they don't come in a certain theme on a certain day or whatever. He has funny ones every day and sad ones and this whole range of human emotion. And so he wanted that to be how the exhibit is. And people can make their own postcards here. So we have them kind of addressed, and then provide materials if they want to do collages or what have you. And then we have a mailbox that they can put them in. And then they're all scanned, and we frequently will have a group of volunteers work with Frank and go through them and pull some to, switch in and out. It's another thing that makes us human is our relationship with animals. It explores it through the idea of pets, pests, and food. Now, this exhibit will be coming down for the new race exhibit. So Race, Power, Resistance, and Change will go into this space. The ways we've eaten have changed over the decade. Meat, we tend to eat more than we did in the past, or, all those kinds of things, and how diets have changed in the United States. If you look at diets from 1915, they're very different from what they are here in 2024. Also to look at cuisines from different countries and cultures. Interesting just to kind of see different menus from different cultures and to get kind of people also thinking about how, even how meat production has changed in the last 100 years. And so to have these kind of stereoscope photographs of really the manufacturing or the production of meat for the market, how it looked 100 years ago.